For the most part, it is a hard and fast rule in the world of classical storytelling that fantasy stories should follow a fantasy structure. A hero, a villain, a world of colorful escapism and wonder without any of the nuances of everyday life. Sometimes there's a wacky side character that acts as comic relief, or a damsel in distress that becomes the hero's love interest as thanks for saving her. This is textbook paint-by-numbers storytelling, and it's so much of a standard that until 1968, the Hays Motion Picture Production Code demanded that all commercially released films follow a similar bog-standard story of clear evil and good. And when video games began incorporating their own interactive stories in the 1980s, they mostly stuck with the status quo. Dragon Quest, Chrono Trigger, even Earthbound to a certain extent, all follow the traditional story of good versus evil. And most importantly, they cement themselves as self-contained worlds. These stories, despite being interactive, are not your own world. You don't get to make all the decisions. You, too, are confined to a set path of branching and controlled, predetermined choices. And then, in 2015, Undertale was released and changed the gaming world forever. Advertised as the friendly RPG where no one has to die, Undertale presents itself on the surface as your average RPG. You play as a silent protagonist going through a fantastical world of wacky characters. Except, as 99% of you probably already know, that's not what Undertale is at all. In fact, what made Undertale stand out from any game released before it was that it broke every rule of a traditional fantasy story. It bridged every gap and threw every convention over the edge of the trash zone. And to understand exactly how it did this, let's talk about RPGs. Ever since the first rudimentary text-based adventures were released in the late 1970s and early 1980s, story-based games have followed their own set of hard and fast conventions. The player must be able to project themselves onto the game's playable character, usually by designing said character to be as much of a blank slate as possible. The game must be treated as a game. Enemies are for killing, bosses are for defeating, worlds are for saving. And perhaps most importantly, the player can't get too attached to the world of the game, and their choices can't be heavily questioned. The world revolves around the player, not the other way around. The nuances of real-life morality and the complexity of personal choices and social dynamics are what fantasy is often used as an escape from, so those two worlds must remain separate. Only one of those worlds continues to exist after the game console gets shut off. Undertale takes those rules, dumps a full bottle of ketchup on top of them, and leaves them soggy and ruined on the table. In Undertale, you are not the protagonist. Frisk is. You may have the ability to move their soul and choose how to go about certain dialogue options, but they are more than the choices you make for them. They're the one that the underground comes to love, not you. They may be silent, but they're full of life and personality. You can see their own interactions with the world paint a picture of them as a character as you play through the game. And in the end, even if you're the one hitting the button to save your game, it's their determination that matters. Secondly, as the tagline cheekily implies, Undertale does not treat its world like that of a game. Your choices have weight. The world doesn't revolve around you, and the supporting cast is under no obligation to find some excuse to accept whatever your choices may be. The onus is on you to treat these characters the right way. And the way the game puts these characters in the spotlight subconsciously pushes you towards developing an attachment to them. On the true pacifist route, which is the route the game actively wants you to take, you're never truly the center of attention. You help Alphys overcome her anxiety and trauma, you help Papyrus learn how to be confident in himself without needing to rely on a superficial status like a position in the Royal Guard, and ultimately, you help Asriel overcome his unresolved grief about the loss of his sibling. You're not even the one to break the barrier. These characters are the focal point of Undertale. There's a reason why we never see Frisk heavily featured again in the credits. They've done their job. That is to say, your impact on the world as the person playing the game has come to an end. You can reset, sure, but the game outright tells you to let Frisk and the monsters have their happy ending. Undertale treats its world as a world, not as some two-dimensional playing field of cardboard cutouts with scripted lines of dialogue. The characters feel real, and most players will want to protect them. And they're actively punished for detaching themselves and treating the game world like nothing more than a classic RPG with no stakes. That's what the concept of love is. The more you detach yourself from your choices and how they impact the world of the game, the more you will see it as nothing more than a game, despite the game itself making a tremendous effort to encourage you to change your way of thinking about its world. That's why the genocide route feels so unintended, empty, and punishing. You're applying classic RPG logic to a world that lives or dies on how much real empathy you could bring yourself to have for these characters in this world that's not your own. It fully bridges the gap between the player and the game, and it's on you if you still choose to detach yourself. And finally, on the topic of characters, Undertale does something that not a lot of games had even remotely attempted before. It applies nuance and allows room for empathy to every character in the game, even those that most games would encourage you to see as irredeemable and cartoonishly villainous. The best example of this, in my opinion, is Flowey. Flowey is a character that can best be described as the absolute platonic ideal of a main villain. He's nefarious, cunning, manipulative, murderous, and is literally physically incapable of feeling love or empathy. He's explicitly presented to you as a terrifying and hateful figure, and he literally takes over the entire game to kill you. And yet, after his final boss fight on the neutral run, you're still given the option to spare him. Although most people who would have gotten to this point in the game would instinctively choose to spare him so as not to risk ruining their true pacifist run, some might ask themselves, why am I sparing this guy? Isn't he the epitome of evil? Hell, even Flowey asks you that himself. You have to press the mercy button upwards of 10 times to successfully spare him. Well, the final traditional story rule that Undertale breaks is that, in Undertale, much like in real life, everyone has a reason behind the choices that they make, and most often, those reasons are something that you can sympathize with. As you learn during the final hours of both the true pacifist route and the genocide route, Flowey was never some irredeemable villain that just wanted power. In fact, Flowey is little more than a child, a scared, lonely kid who lost the person he cared the most about, and in his grief was unjustly killed himself. But he woke up. He'd been blessed, or burdened, with the weight of immortality. And without his soul, he couldn't feel empathy or love or compassion anymore. He became a hollow shell, living out countless timelines as a bitter, half-alive husk in a sort of hell loop. He, too, began to see the world around him as a game. And yet, in the true pacifist ending, he finally faces his trauma. After an eternity of living out different timelines over and over again like some sort of reverse Diavolo death loop, he's finally able to come to terms with the fact that Kara's gone. Undertale may have been marketed as an RPG, but it ends as a game with no real villains making it out of the underground. Only people. People making choices. And in a way, because your choices affect the world in sometimes irreversible ways, you become a part of the game too. I discovered Undertale as a child, and now, as an adult, I can't help but feel hollow and detached whenever I see a new trailer for one of those big-budget AAA games. And frankly, I believe I now understand why. Once you've had a gaming experience that shows you that the rules of cookie-cutter fantasy fiction are purely optional, and you've experienced characters that feel alive and whole from just some lines of text, that same old inoffensive cut-and-dry storytelling just starts to feel two-dimensional and boring, no matter how flashy the visuals are. If you enjoyed this video, I'd encourage you to leave a like and subscribe. I don't get monetized for these videos, and I don't particularly want to either. And a like just shows that you enjoyed, that you want more of these types of videos in the future. Also, leave a comment if there's any specific topic you want me to cover next. I've been interested in doing a video dissecting some parts of Omori, another one of my favorite games, specifically the Hikikomori route, so if you want that, make sure to let me know.